Lostas, are you going to be standing there? You're going to be there? Okay. Alors, bon après-midi. On va avoir un peu plus d'air que ce matin. On a ouvert la salle. Parce que c'est pas fini, ni en temps, ni en qualité de personne. Alors, cet après-midi, on continue une partie de l'après-midi sur les abus, les négligences. Les abus et négligences portés à l'ultime, si on pourrait dire, à leur plus haut degré. Nous aurons le professeur Lostas de l'Université McGill qui va nous entretenir de jusqu'où peuvent aller certaines violences et puis qui va réfléchir avec nous sur comment ça peut arriver ici, chez nous, en 1995, avec les valeurs sociales, le système social. Fait qu'il va se poser la question comment on peut arriver à traiter des gens de cette façon-là. Elle a fait une réflexion, c'est comme ça que j'ai découvert, qui s'appelle Euthanasia of Persons with Severe Handicaps, Refuting the Irrationalizations. C'est absolument superbe comme texte. Ça a été fait il y a quelques années et le professeur Lostas avait des réticences parce que c'était pas récent. Mais je lui ai dit, ne vous en faites pas, dans 20 ans, madame, faudra encore entendre ces choses-là parce qu'on touche à l'essentiel. Alors, sauf qu'aujourd'hui, elle va ouvrir peut-être, ne pas se limiter à l'euthanasie comme telle, mais toucher aux violences extrêmes, parce que des petits gestes de violence quotidiens deviennent extrêmes à la longue. Le coût peut même arriver à une perte de vie. Et c'est pas non plus particulier, puis c'est pas non plus des cas isolés. Alors, Madame Lostas is a teacher at McGill, and depuis 25 ans, for the past 25 years, she's been working on the inclusion of individuals with disabilities in their families, schools, and communities. Elle a travaillé beaucoup. She has worked extensively with teachers and school administrators to help them include students with disabilities in regular classrooms. Her work at McGill has included teacher preparation, research, program development, and advocacy. Et beaucoup de réflexion. Et beaucoup d'implications personnelles, je pense. Alors, je vous laisse avec elle.
Oh, it's not on. Yeah. Here, Tim? Oh, okay. How's this? All right, that's good. Is that good? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hélène. Let's see what time. Well, how about like a half an hour instead of
25? 14:25?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll try that. Why don't you make sure to tell me when I have 5 minutes left? Oh, no, so that I could stop. I also happen to be a mother of 4 children, 2 of whom have disabilities, and I could tell you just some wonderful and really funny, great stories. But today we're talking about really serious issues, so I'm going to start with a serious story. This is a true story, though the names are fictional. The family setting. Can you hear me? Okay. Mother, 34 years old, hospital nurse. Father, 35 years old, lawyer. 2 normal children in the family. In the late fall of 1963, Mr. and Mrs. Nevin gave birth to a premature baby boy. Soon after birth, the child was diagnosed as having Down syndrome, trisomy 21, with the added complication of an intestinal blockage. The latter could be corrected with an operation of quite nominal risk, but without the operation, the child could not be fed and would die. At the time of birth, Mrs. Nevin overheard the doctor express his belief that the child had Down syndrome. She immediately indicated she did not want the child. The next day, in consultation with a physician, she maintained this position, refusing to give permission for the corrective operation on the intestinal block. Her husband supported her in this position, saying that his wife knew more about these things than he did. The reason the mother gave for her position was, quote, it would be unfair to the other children in the household to raise them with the Down's child. The physician explained to the parents that the degree of mental retardation cannot be predicted at birth. The child could have a very severe intellectual disability or a mild disability. However, given the parents' decision, the hospital staff did not seek a court order to override the decision. The child was put in a side room and, over an 11-day period, allowed to starve to death. Although this incident took place many years ago, the practice of withholding life-saving treatment from handicapped newborns is still a very, very serious problem today. This afternoon, I would like to speak to you about some of the underlying belief systems that lead people to do something like withhold treatment to a newborn baby. These are really the same belief systems that form the basis for institutional abuse. And in fact, of course, the ultimate form of abuse is death. Okay, so Tim, can you put on the first overhead? Now, euthanasia is commonly used to mean mercy killing. However, despite its alleged merciful intent, euthanasia is a crime under traditional criminal law, and it is considered to be murder. Okay, Tim, now the next one on top. Recognizing the euphemistic overtones of the term, St. Martin referred to euthanasia as death selection, and Wolfensberger termed it one type of death making. And in the incident that I just read, of course, it is clearly death making. In spite of the fact that many perceive it to be murder, the practice of euthanasia with persons with severe handicaps has received a great deal of support from ethicists, physicians, and even theologians, and of course, the general public. Okay, number 3. Thank you. Among the supporters of so-called euthanasia, and when I use the word euthanasia, you will realize that, of course, I'm meaning the death-making that we just discussed. Among proponents of euthanasia, there is considerable agreement that not treating infants with severe disabilities with the intention of, quote, letting them die, is a legitimate form of medical intervention. And when you read the medical literature, it is quite shocking. This process of so-called letting a child die is called in the literature selective non-treatment. But it is so accepted so widely as a type of treatment that some refer to it simply as selection, and it's even referred to as selective treatment. I mean, just think about that for a minute. You're letting a baby die. You're killing a baby by not giving a life-saving operation, and that is called selective treatment. It's an absurd inversion of meanings. Why is this practice so widely accepted? Okay, Tim, can you switch to the fourth one? Proponents of euthanasia have put forth many rationalizations for its use with persons who have severe disabilities. Some arguments focus on the good to society of allowing disabled individuals to die, and they're thinking of the cost to society. Other arguments for euthanasia center on the good to the individual families, and they're thinking of the stress on the family itself. However, the most pervasive of the rationalizations for euthanasia, and the most convincing to people, appeal to the alleged good to the children themselves of being allowed to die. Now, what are the belief systems that lead people to think that these children are better off dead? They really fall into two main categories. One, that the children are not really people at all, and therefore they're better off dead. And secondly, that the children will lack a good quality of life, and therefore they're better off dead. And I'm going to explain both of these rationalizations and explain why they don't make any sense to us. In the first rationalization, it's proposed that the individuals in question are not really people anyway. Central to this argument, of course, is the notion that some offspring of man and woman are human and some are not, which is, of course, an absurdity. And yet it's very well developed in the literature. Now, what are the characteristics that are required for humanness? Usually intelligence rates the highest. Proponents of this point of view say that if an individual lacks a certain level of intelligence, he or she is then not really a person. Fletcher, a very well-known ethicist, reflected this point of view when, in all seriousness, he said, quote, "Any individual who falls below the IQ 40 mark on a standard Stanford-Binet test is questionably a person. Below the 20 mark, not a person." Fletcher wrote that, now listen to this, Fletcher wrote that a father who gave instructions to withhold medical treatment for his son who had Down syndrome, he wrote that the father should feel no guilt. For guilt, he said, is only relevant when wrong is done to a person, and, in Fletcher's actual words, a Downs is not a person. Other characteristics that are thought to be required for humanhood are sometimes considered a sense of self-consciousness and the ability to have human relationships. Whatever the characteristic, the individuals in question are not considered really people unless they have the adequate amount of whatever the feature is. So now we have to ask ourselves, what are the results of labeling persons as non-humans? And Tim, you want to switch that? You could just pull it down so we see the top is, sorry, the other way. Push it, yeah, okay. First, of course, abuse is typically imposed on those defined as subhuman. Robertson, a lawyer, explained that defining someone as non-human is the first step to abuse and even killing. And we all know this in our daily lives, that when we consider somebody as less than human, it gives us the ability then to do terrible things to them. You see this in every war. Robertson said, quote, "Slavery, witch hunts, and wars have all been justified by their perpetrators on the grounds that they hold their victims to be less than fully human. To question someone's humanity or personhood is a first step to mistreatment and killing." Now, when we look at the history of how persons with disabilities have been treated, we have no reason to doubt the accuracy of Robertson's position. During this century alone, we have seen that people with disabilities who have been defined as non-human have been severely mistreated and even killed. And of course, that's in fact what we're discussing today. Defining them as non-human has been related to their prolonged abuse in institutions. This abuse has been very well documented by many, and again, even today, we hear it over and over again. The Rohr Institute noted, quote, "We will probably never know the full extent of the crimes perpetrated against mentally handicapped people and humanity itself within the walls of residential institutions around the world." Now, how could such horrors take place? Burton Blatt, who is a leading humanitarian and a leading reformer, said it's impossible to torture another human being, quote, "without agreeing and believing that the victim is not really human." Now, a second result of labeling people as non-humans is that a slippery slope usually begins. How do we determine the cutoff points on who is human and who is not? And how do we keep the cutoff points from changing? Wolfensberger said, quote, "When it comes to death making, the so-called domino theory is indeed valid." In the Nazi euthanasia program, in quotes, that Dick Savsey referred to, the criteria for who was human changed rapidly and it became increasingly global. Can you see this from where you're sitting? First, it was people with severe disabilities who were murdered, and then it became people with less severe impairments, those who were physically atypical, like people who are dwarfs, those who were racially tainted, then those with a different social identity, like gypsies, those who had behavior problems, those who had enuresis, which it means bedwetting, those with odd-shaped ears, and those even with very dark eyes. In all, there is no adequate way to make a cutoff point on who is human and who is not. Thus, the cutting point can change drastically depending upon the whim of the one who's making the definition. This is a crucial issue in understanding the possible spread of euthanasia to increasingly large groups. And of course, I'm talking about infants today, but we know that this is a growing trend in institutions for people who are elderly. This problem has been referred to as the slippery slope by Camisar, and Camisar contended that the slippery slope, once begun, is indeed difficult to terminate, and where it will terminate is anyone's guess. Okay, Tim, you want to put up the next, number 7? The second rationalization for so-called euthanasia is that the individuals lack a necessary quality of life, and therefore they would be better off dead than to exist in a meaningless life, often with suffering and sorrow. Now, what is the quality of life that is considered necessary for a meaningful existence? Several factors are usually used to make this determination. The most important are the severity of the individual's disability, the prognosis for development, and the prediction for future suffering. Now, using quality of life as a basis for deciding who should live and who should die is very, very common. For example, Affleck, a researcher, found that potential quality of life was the most important factor among physicians in making decisions about whether or not to treat infants with Down syndrome. Quality of life has most often been advocated as the most important basis for ethical and legal standards about whether to treat infants or not to treat them. The quality of life perspective was clearly advocated, for example, by the Australian College of Pediatrics when they said, quote, First and foremost, the right of the child to live is paramount, provided that survival is consistent with an acceptable quality of life. Now, what is wrong with this approach? Want to put in the next overhead? First, of course, how could we ever determine what is worthwhile for somebody else's life? We certainly cannot make a judgment on other people's behalf that their lives will not be worth living. Diamond pointed out that it is not up to parents, physicians, or the society at large to assume that a child with a severe disability would rather be dead. In a most interesting article, he reported on a study in which a large number of children with severe impairments due to thalidomide, this was a drug that was taken many years ago by women and it resulted in very, very severe physical and intellectual disabilities. They did a study looking at these children, and the children were questioned. And they were questioned once they became adults. The study indicated that the children, quote, do indeed value their lives, that they are glad they were born, and that they look forward to the future with hope and with pleasant anticipation. Allen and Allen commented on the danger of making stereotypic judgments about what is meaningful in the lives of people with disabilities. Why, they asked, would persons who are impaired necessarily find life less worthwhile than people who do not have a serious disability? And they said, quote, if we ask what kind of people find life meaningless enough, for example, to commit suicide, we find that it is not the retarded or severely ill who are most at risk for committing suicide, but rather college students, which is a sad statement, of course, but it makes the point about the level of disability. A second difficulty with this way of thinking is that it's likely that persons making the quality of life predictions about individuals with severe disabilities may hold unduly pessimistic ideas about the children's ability to grow, develop, and enjoy life. This issue has been visible in debates over the euthanasia of infants born with spina bifida. Differing opinions about potential for their development became acutely apparent when an infant with this condition was denied treatment and apparently was being starved, allegedly because of the physicians' and parents' pessimistic predictions about the future quality of the child's life. The Spina Bifida Association assumed an advocacy role in this case by publicly calling for, quote, treatment of this baby and of every infant born with spina bifida, because they said 90% of children born with this condition today grow up to live normal, healthy lives. By the way, I think they should be treated regardless of whether they grow up to lead normal, healthy lives or not. There's also been an enormous discrepancy in opinion about the extent to which children born with Down syndrome can develop. Pediatricians who consider selective non-treatment for infants with this condition hold low expectations for the children's development, growth, and enjoyment of life. For example, a prominent physician, chief of the reproductive genetics unit in an Eastern University hospital, was quoted as saying, "You show me just one mongoloid," excuse me folks, that's his term, "that has an educable IQ. I have never seen even one." So, as absurd as these things are, we have to look still at the final and third and most important reason that a quality of life perspective doesn't make any sense. And that is that the quality we enjoy depends on others and how others treat us, of course. The quality of life experienced by people with disabilities depends more on how others relate to them than on their condition at birth. In other words, meaningful relationships are required for meaningful lives, And meaningful relationships require others. They require us. Few authors have expressed this notion more eloquently than Jean Vanier, who has chosen to live with previously institutionalized adults. Vanier spoke of the men with mental handicaps with whom he has shared his life. He said that the men who had been institutionalized were deeply wounded by their severe rejection, isolation, and lack of love. We must ask ourselves, what is the cause of the misery that they experience in their lives? Is it a result of their condition at birth, or is it the result of the lack of human caring treatment, perhaps the lack of even one person in the world caring about them? Vanier said, quote, "We begin to feel inner happiness when we feel certain we are important to someone, that when we die, someone will cry over us, that we have left an emptiness not only in a bed, but in a heart." In sum, the risk of widespread euthanasia, in quotes, to persons with severe handicaps continues to exist, and rationales that appeal to the good of the person being killed will most likely be applied when the decision to select non-treatment is made. Many life and death decisions are now being made in the hands of hospital infant care committees. Recommending the denial of life-saving interventions is within the realm of their responsibilities. This may not be an issue for infants who are already dying, or whose condition makes it impossible for them to respond to treatment because their lives cannot be saved. However, controversies will most certainly arise for children who are severely impaired but who need treatment in order to live. The rationalizations that I've described today are likely to be brought to bear when euthanasia is recommended and chosen. As advocates for people with severe disabilities, we have to be clear and vocal in refuting these rationalizations and in affirming the absolute worth of each life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lostis. Est-ce qu'il y a des gens qui ont des questions? Oui, madame. Lostis. Dr. Lostis?
Yeah. Well, the particular research that I had done, I had focused on infants, but I hope that all of you would be able to make that jump easily to people, any people living in institutions, and most certainly people who are elderly. These rationalizations, this way of thinking, is 100% used in regard to the issues that people who are elderly living in homes and institutions are facing.
I have only one comment to make, and it comes from personal experience, but one example that was not brought up, I believe, when a doctor uses the excuse that the person has lived long enough and there's just no money available to prolong that life.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the consensus of the opinion among the medical professionals who apparently have sat together. Now, I've heard that many times, used over and over again.
Well,
how does this come in? I mean,
yes.
How does one argue? How do I mean, somebody's 99 years old, I mean, carrying it, and is very sick, but at the same time very dear to someone. How do you argue that if it's a choice between a baby or a 99-year-old, which one are you going to save? a very serious ethical dilemma.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Oh, it's a huge ethical dilemma today because
And this is what it is. We have never. I
Mhm.
mean, it comes.
But as a society, I think we have to come to grips with these issues. Certainly, even with infants, the cost of life-saving intervention is one of the reasons that will be used, to say that the child shouldn't be given the intervention. But that's usually not as convincing to people as the one about that it's really good for, it's for their own good. But the issues of the stretch and the conflict and the tension between how is money going to be spent? Is it going to be used to enhance the lives of people who are older, save children who are babies? I mean, these are urgent things that we have to grapple with as a society, I think.
And I work in a neonatal unit, but this isn't pertaining to this specific one right now. I've worked in other areas. What do you say to keeping very, very small babies alive in the name of research?
Oh.
Now, it's a catch-22, okay? Because yes, maybe this person will be able to live a relatively productive life. But if the reason to keep it alive is to do procedures and do, it's when I was listening to you, I heard what you were saying, but I see things sometimes that make me heartbroken.
Yes.
So I had to bring that up.
Yes.
That things are done in the name of research, not humaneness.
That would be worth maybe another conference.
Okay, I'll work on it.
Bien, merci beaucoup. Alors, Madame Wronski va nous faire part d'un témoignage. Il s'agit de son vécu. Vous avez d'ailleurs un article dans votre pochette qu'on a inclus où elle a livré un témoignage en ce qui concerne les conditions de vie de sa mère. Elle nous entretiendra aussi des conditions de vie de son père et de sa mère et comment se vivent certaines situations en institution. Je vous rappelle que les témoignages que nous avons entendus tout au long de la matinée et cet après-midi ne sont pas des cas isolés. Ce sont des témoignages qui sont émis par les gens qui ont le courage et la force de parler. Je sais pertinemment que pour Mme Wronski, cet après-midi, c'est particulièrement difficile pour elle.
Okay, it's very difficult for me, and I've asked this young lady to help me out, and she's from the Users Committee, and she's here to help me, as she always was. I'm very nervous speaking in front of a large group. As Helen told you, it's very difficult for me. My mother just passed away 6 months ago. But the efforts that these two ladies have made to put this together, I couldn't say no. I have nothing written. I'm just going to speak from the heart. I couldn't bring myself to write down anything. It was just too painful. I just want to start by saying that my father was at Maimonides Geriatric Hospital. It was about 4 years ago. He was there for about 2 years. I witnessed physical abuse. I walked into the room. I was walking down the hall to visit my father. I heard a patient crying. I had never heard my father cry. I went to his room, I opened the door, and I saw the orderly with his hands on my father's neck in the corner of the room. The orderly ran out of the room. My father was saying, "There are murderers here. What kind of place did you put me in?" I was shaking, like I am now, because I'm so nervous. I was trying to console my father. I was looking at the red marks on his neck. What was I to do? My mother was upstairs on another floor as well. I couldn't hold it in anymore, and I went to the social worker and told her what I had seen. Anyways, for speaking up, this is what happens, the repercussions. In my father's case, he was living on Insure Plus because he had had surgery earlier for cancer, and I was there to basically feed him. I knew what he liked. I brought him special things, and I was there for the evening meal. It came to, they didn't like it. I guess I saw too much in the dining room of other patients not being fed, of staff eating the food, whatever. I was a threat for whatever reason. They restricted me from being in the dining room. I had to wait outside while my father did nothing in the dining room because nobody knew how to handle him like I did. And when he came out an hour later, and another reason they used too was he had to socialize. Well, no one on that particular floor talked to anybody else. These patients were at a level where they couldn't communicate. So I waited for him to come outside of the dining room, where I took the can of Insure and worked on him. Then it turned out his cancer came back. And a sign of it was, which I wasn't aware because I'm not a professional, he was spitting up all day long. I ran to the nurses. I said, something is wrong. He's just spitting all day. He's not even drinking his Insure. He was losing 5 to 6 pounds a week. And they just says, there's nothing wrong. He spits. I said, no person sits and spits all day long and doesn't drink and is deteriorating. Well, 2 months went by roughly, and he choked one night. I was still there at Maimonides, where he was taken to the hospital, and it turned out he had cancer of the larynx. All my pleas that something was wrong, to help, to send him to a specialist, fell on deaf ears, went to the medical director, just considered a complainer. My father was 2 months, roughly, at the Jewish General Hospital, where we were both treated with dignity and respect. They cared for him. They cared for me. They took the time to console me. One doctor, my father's specialist at the Jewish, the chief in his field, came over to me one day and said to me, you know, Dina, I'm older than you. Chances are I'm going to get sick before you do. Would you take care of me? I had other doctors who spent their time with me, nurses, head nurses. My father was transferred from one floor to another floor because they had inserted a trach. So he went to another floor. The head nurses from each floor kept in touch with me and kept telling me the door was open if I had any questions or needed any information. Nurses came down to the palliative care floor where my father's third stay was, where they had dealt with me on other floors, and they came to me just to tell me, to see how I was doing, to tell me to go out, to walk around. They even got social services to come in to give me some breathing time because I was just a devoted daughter, and I spent every day with him. Then I had to go back and face Maimonides, where my mother was, who, after my father passed away, I was there for my mother. This was my father's wish, to take care of my mother. Anyway, my mother deteriorated. She was doing very well. She was walking. She was able to eat by herself, no problems. As soon as she had a stroke and things, she deteriorated. When she needed their help, that's when the problems began. All I asked for was the basic care that every patient is entitled to, which they, the hospital, Maimonides, made a care plan, which they did not follow. And I just brought it to their attention. Simple things like, my mother was continent. Why is she in diapers? Why are you taking away the little that she has? They put her in diapers. Why? So they can take her, like previous people have said, so they can take her at their convenience. I also pointed out my mother was at the point, before she had her stroke, was walking with a walker. They were pulling the walker, that this lady witnessed it one time and was so horrified that she let out a yell and said to me, Dina, how can you allow this? I said, Lillian, How many times have I told them? It's a question, let her fall and break her hip. That's the only, what can I do? Obviously, my complaints always fell on deaf ears. And again, just ignored. So I asked for things. Why can't she be coaxed to walk closer to the walker where she can, you know, for her safety? Why can't she be changed and not smell of urine? And besides the smell, which I would tolerate, it was my mother. She was prone to bladder infections. Things like her teeth, simple thing that you would expect them to do every night. I again showed Mrs. Reinblatt. She was horrified. I said, Lillian, watch, I will go into the bathroom and wash them, which I did, but I couldn't do it all the time. There was just so much I had to do. So these were your simple, basic needs that couldn't be met, and I was considered a chronic complainer for bringing it to their attention. I'd like to say, too, on one occasion, yes, I would spend mealtime with my mother. My mother liked fresh fruit. I would bring her fresh fruit. I asked them to supply her with fresh fruit. Why did I ask? It wasn't a special request. Others were getting it. Why couldn't my mother have it when she liked it? No. The whole thing was, it was easy to shut me up because it was easier to deal with one person than to rectify a problem. And the problem in this institution, Maimonides Hospital, is, number one, they cannot recognize that they have a problem. They don't recognize it by losing all the good nurses. Like they said, the good ones cannot work there. They have come forward with stories, similar stories, and cannot work under those conditions and are driven out by the bad ones. So this is where I fault the system, whereas they don't even recognize they have a problem. They rather take it out on me. So where were my mother's rights? It came to the point that I had to see Julius Gray, as you know, a very prominent lawyer in Montreal, to handle my case, which was funded by the Users Committee. He took the case because it was against human rights and medical rights. And again, I was restricted in my visits to 1 hour in the lobby, in a corner in the lobby, because I couldn't stay in the lobby because there was smoke, where they would bring my mother down for this hourly visit, which they most of the time brought her late, smelled of urine, had to go to the bathroom, where I said, she has to go. And they would say, but she went before. I said, how do you know? You weren't on the shift then. I mean, they always had an answer. She was brought back upstairs. I couldn't spend mealtime with her. And my husband would, I wanted to say to him, my husband visited regularly. We did things for her, and I'll just give you an example of reasons of why they restricted me was for basically sticking my hand in a loaf of bread to take a slice of bread for my mother. So in other words, I must have touched 2 other slices, and they felt this was a reason to restrict me. I took a scale to weigh my mother, one of these scales that is on wheels, and one nurse had no objection to it, so I did it. But the other nurse who had it in for me obviously made a note of it, that this was, you know, a no-no. Basically, I transferred my mother from her wheelchair to a chair at her request, because there we could do some exercise. I can get her to stand, and we danced as she stood with her walker. And I gave her some quality. I was the only one who came to her daily and gave her this quality. I washed her clothes, which I couldn't do because I was restricted. I did physiotherapy with her. I did, well, you know, call it what you want. I would do, you know, because of her stroke, I worked with her hands. And most of all, we laughed together and we enjoyed. And as this lady can tell you, she witnessed us, and I only hope one day, I've given my life for my parents, I would do it again, and I only hope one day my daughter will treat me the same way. And I just want to say, there's an ombudsman at Maimonides Hospital who I went to see, who's supposed to be impartial, who was not impartial, who stuck right, who, it is a clique of, and you just can't break it, and I couldn't do it alone. And I want to tell you, when my mother passed away, I was called, not right away, and when I got to the hospital, I was saying, where was an ambulance? My mother her breathing was very labored, her eyes were coming out of her socket. I called the ambulance. I said there was no doctor, there were no nurses who gave me any information. There was supposed to be a doctor on call. Nothing ever I never heard anything. He didn't do anything. Her lungs filled up with water. I had left specific instructions, which were left on her chart, that my mother's heart attack presents with vomiting. No ambulance was called for at least 40 minutes, and when they were finally called, they were never told it was an emergency. And in Côte St. Luc, we have EMS, which is Emergency Medical Services, which are there in 5 minutes, especially for cardiac arrest, and they were never told. Okay, and my mother then ended up at the Jewish, and by then, unfortunately, it was too late. Now, I'd like to get answers what happened that night at Maimonides, and as you are my witness, as I have asked so many questions in writing, they were ignored and only answered what they wanted. Okay, I want to say too, my husband was there, and because he asked questions, he was also restricted. He was told he could only call 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, which what was the point? My mother was asleep. There was nothing that could be done for her at that point. But they made it just so difficult. My mother's wishes also were to go to synagogue, to go out. I couldn't take her outside because it wasn't my hour of visit. She had to stay in front of the TV slumped over because she couldn't go outside because she couldn't see her daughter. And when she was brought down by my husband, whom my husband said, I'm not restricted. Why can't I take her downstairs? Well, because your wife is downstairs, so she may see her daughter for an extra few minutes. So where is my mother's human rights? Is this justice? Is this how my mother's life had to end? Did it give the right to management and directors of nursing and ombudsmen to act in this manner? What did they do for my mother? I'm ending it like this, and I hope somebody can benefit from this and know what's going on in these institutions. And all my complaints fell on deaf ears, and they just wanted to keep me quiet. And now I'm on the Users Committee, and I just received a letter from the president of the Users Committee telling me to leave the Users Committee because, as I told you earlier, they funded me to see Julius Gray because it was a violation of human rights. And now she has said she doesn't want to pay me for the visit to Julius Gray. So I said, well, then I'll have to take legal action because it was a contract. And she says, because it's a conflict of interest, then I should leave the committee. So it just goes to show that in the Users Committee, in the Ombudsman, it is all a clique sticking together, just trying to keep their jobs at any price. Thank you.
Il y a des questions? Alors, on arrête 15 minutes pour la pause. On revient à 3.
On m'a demandé d'aider les professionnels là, j'étais le seul parent. Et on m'a envoyé comme chef de service, on avait toute une résidence illustrée ce matin-là, et moi j'avais une résidence, et je suis allée au-devant d'eux des autobus, la police en avant en arrière. Ils sont arrivés à la résidence, un jeune homme, 3 belles femmes, et ça a été une des plus belles journées de ma vie. Ils sont arrivés, ils étaient chez eux, et j'ai couché à terre à côté d'une, juste une qui était pas mal en détresse, puis j'ai couché à terre à côté d'elle, je ne pouvais pas coucher dans son lit, je couchais avec elle, puis sinon il fallait qu'elle s'habitue. C'était merveilleux. 88 personnes sorties, on les a réellement enlevées, madame.
88 qui sont mieux, une partie de solution, pas la seule solution, une partie. Maintenant, je vous laisse entre les mains de Jean-Pierre Ménard. Maître Ménard est un avocat dans la pratique privée. C'est lui qui a mené la cause, entre autres, comme procureur, dont vous venez d'être instruit à l'instant. Il va vous parler des difficultés, puis il va vous partager finalement son vécu là-dessus. Et ça fait aussi partie de solutions au niveau légal. Alors, Jean-Pierre.
Alors, d'abord, ce que je pourrais vous dire, c'est que quand je vois comment les gens sont aujourd'hui, je peux vous dire une chose, c'est qu'au-delà de la victoire judiciaire qu'on a remportée dans ce dossier-là, la plus belle victoire qu'on peut avoir, la plus belle rémunération qu'on peut avoir, c'est d'entendre ces gens-là dire qu'est-ce qu'ils sont aujourd'hui, qu'est-ce qu'ils font aujourd'hui. Les films, évidemment, ne disent pas tout. Il y en a qui se sont mariés. Il y en a qui ont enfin réalisé des projets de vie. J'ai eu l'occasion de parler de l'histoire à quelques reprises dans d'autres panels avec certains des résidents avec moi. Et quand j'entends des gens à côté de moi dire « Bastard, je suis libre, je fais qu'est-ce que je veux, comme je le veux », ça risque d'être mieux compris comme ça. Donc, entendre les gens dire « je suis libre, je fais qu'est-ce que je veux, je fais les choses qui me tentent de faire », puis les gens font des projets de vie, ont un plan de vie. Ça peut paraître simple, mais c'est beaucoup quand on n'en a jamais eu. Et il faut en avoir été privé pendant longtemps pour savoir qu'est-ce que ça signifie, pouvoir en faire un. Alors, quand j'entends ceux que j'appelle mes amis de Saint-Théophile raconter cette histoire-là, je ne cacherai pas que, même sur le plan personnel, ça touche toujours beaucoup. On voit ça avec le recul. Ça peut sembler avec le recul, facile de dire, ben, comment ça se fait que ça a pu durer, ou encore, ben, ça a dû être facile, c'était tellement évident, c'était tellement abusif. Vous seriez surpris de savoir les obstacles qu'on a dû surmonter. Pourquoi? Parce que dans ces matières-là, ceux qui auraient pu être normalement nos alliés, c'était souvent nos adversaires les plus durs. Et vous seriez surpris de savoir le niveau de preuve qu'on a dû amener pour convaincre les gens que ces personnes-là étaient abusées. Que les résidents étaient abusés, que les résidents ne vivaient pas qu'est-ce qu'ils devraient vivre, qu'est-ce que normalement ils auraient dû avoir. Et on pense des fois qu'au niveau de l'État, puis je vais parler d'abord de ça peut-être comme leçon à tirer de cette histoire-là. On pense toujours que l'État nous protège, que l'État protège les personnes vulnérables. On crée d'ailleurs des institutions pour dire, ben, les gens en institution, ils vont être bien. C'est l'État, c'est le système public qui les protège. Et l'État agit pour nous dans ces matières-là, puis agit en lieu et place des familles. Bon. Sauf que dans un des gros problèmes connus tout au long de cette histoire-là, c'était de s'apercevoir que les autorités publiques, puis là, je ne parle pas tellement des gens de première ligne, là, je parle des gestionnaires, puis des penseurs, puis des politiciens surtout. À quel point ces gens-là sont davantage préoccupés par toutes sortes d'autres intérêts que les droits et la qualité de vie des personnes. On a eu constamment à faire face à toutes sortes de situations. Je vais simplement vous en donner quelques-unes. Par exemple, les inspecteurs de division de l'agrément, lorsqu'ils venaient faire l'inspection de cet établissement-là, il y avait dit dès 81. Ça, ce sont des gens payés par l'État, là. Dès 81, on avait dit, il règne dans cette boîte-là une exploitation éhontée de la clientèle, comme on dit sur la vidéo. Sauf que, pourquoi ça ne s'est pas fermé? Pourquoi on n'a pas mis le cadenas dès ce moment-là? Lors de l'enquête, puis c'est parce que le même rapport est de 1985, là, les gestionnaires sont venus parler. Puis on nous disait, ben écoutez, c'est un centre d'accueil privé conventionné, le propriétaire a le droit de faire de l'argent, il a le droit de faire du profit. Par ailleurs, nos publics ne sont pas tellement mieux que ça fait qu'on n'est pas pour commencer à se montrer plus sévère envers les privés. On va attendre que nos publics soient en bon état, puis après ça, on s'occupera des privés. Bon, c'est ce genre de mentalité-là qui existait un peu partout. L'autre affaire aussi qu'on nous disait, on nous disait, écoutez, ça je l'ai entendu plusieurs reprises, même au niveau, puis là je parle pas du propriétaire. Le propriétaire, on peut comprendre que dans sa logique, ils comprennent ça. C'est-à-dire quand il disait, par exemple, écoutez, c'est pas si grave que ça, c'est des personnes déficientes, là. Mais on a entendu aussi ces choses-là, de la part des gestionnaires du système public. Ben écoutez, là, c'est-tu si terrible que ça, ou encore, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire de plus, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire de mieux? Dans le fond, ils sont peut-être mieux là qu'ailleurs. Bon. On a entendu ça souvent. Par rapport à tous les éléments d'abus qu'on a amenés en preuve, personne ne nous croyait au commencement. On racontait ces histoires-là, par exemple, que les gens étaient infantilisés, que les gens étaient abusés. Il y a des gens il y a même à diverses reprises des enquêteurs qui avaient constaté des abus de cette nature-là, mais on disait, ah, ben c'est isolé, ou ben encore, ça touche juste quelques histoires, ou encore, c'est pas assez important. Puis je peux vous écouter, puis des fois, c'est des choses très fondamentales. Il n'y a qu'un exemple, par exemple, à un moment donné, on avait enlevé les portes des cabinets de toilettes. Bon, quand les gens à la toilette, il n'y avait pas de porte d'un cabinet. Le propriétaire disait que c'était pour combattre l'homosexualité. Bon, c'est une manière, une technique, quelque part. Je ne sais pas où il l'avait appris, mais en tout cas. À un autre moment donné, on avait retiré le papier toilette des toilettes. Puis je parle de choses fondamentales, là. Hein. Là, pourquoi? Parce que les gens bouchaient les toilettes. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'il fallait qu'ils fassent? C'est que quand les gens avaient besoin d'aller aux toilettes, il fallait qu'il y ait voir la responsable des programmes, qui aurait été mieux à sa place dans une institution carcérale, là. C'est elle qui leur donnait une certaine quantité. Puis comme les gens craignaient beaucoup d'aller la voir, souvent ils allaient à la salle de bain sans aller la voir. Et on a arrêté ce système-là pour une raison bien simple, pas pour au nom de la dignité des personnes. C'est parce qu'à un moment donné, les odeurs dans la boîte étaient telles que ça n'avait pas de bon sens. Je prends un exemple peut-être un petit peu extrême, là, mais c'était connu. Et au niveau des gens qui s'occupaient de gérer tout ça, je parle au niveau du ministère de la Santé et des Services sociaux, au niveau des conseils régionaux de santé et des services sociaux, qui sont maintenant les régies régionales, là. Mais là, on disait, c'est pas si pire que ça, ou ben c'est un détail, ou ben c'est pas si important, ou bien c'est bon. On trouvait toutes sortes de moyens pour dire, on peut pas faire grand-chose, ou encore il faudrait de l'argent pour sortir les gens de là, puis c'est pas si pire que ça. Ça, là, on a entendu ça constamment. Et la plainte qu'on a faite à la Commission des droits de la personne, c'était une plainte pour exploitation. Il a fallu qu'on démontre, puis l'enquête a duré 73 jours. On a eu 73 jours de procès, si on veut, en première instance, pour démonter pièce par pièce un système d'exploitation. Puis si nous, on était capable de le faire avec peu de moyens, on peut se demander pourquoi les organismes publics ne l'ont pas fait avec des moyens beaucoup plus considérables. C'est qu'essentiellement, parce qu'on était trop préoccupés de concilier toutes sortes de choses, toutes sortes d'intérêts, et non pas l'intérêt des clients. Dans ce genre de choses-là, si on veut parler de protection des droits, quand je parle de protection, je ne parle pas en termes paternalistes, là, en termes d'engagement. Il faut avoir une orientation, un alignement ou des valeurs. Il faut qu'on soit, si on veut, pendant un terme anglais, le client-minded, si vous voulez. Il faut qu'on ait un alignement. Et le problème, c'est que trop souvent, au niveau des organismes publics, ceux qui font ce travail-là ne l'ont pas. Puis ça, là-dessus, je vous dirais que ça n'a pas changé beaucoup. Quand on regarde les systèmes de plainte qui existent actuellement au niveau de la santé, quand on regarde les mécanismes en vigueur au niveau des régies régionales ou même je dirais même plus au niveau du bureau du commissaire aux plaintes, on n'a pas cette préoccupation-là. On a une préoccupation de conciliation, une préoccupation plus de temporisation, de gestion des conflits, si on veut. Et on espère beaucoup que les gens vont se tanner, que les gens vont s'user. Puis dans cette affaire-là, dans le site Saint-Théophile, parce que je pense que c'est important de regarder un peu comment une dynamique de même a pu s'enclencher. Ça a commencé par un parent qui a vu des abus, puis qui a dit non, moi je ne ferme pas les yeux là-dessus. Puis il a commencé à cogner à des portes. Puis il a cogné à toutes les portes possibles. Et partout où il disait qu'il exagérait, que c'était pas vrai, que c'était pas si pire que ça. Ou encore l'autre extrême, là, c'est que c'était centre privé. Il ne faut pas trop en demander. C'est des personnes déficientes, il ne faut pas exagérer, etc. Puis ça, là, chaque porte. Bon, jusqu'à un moment donné qu'on aboutisse chez nous. Puis là, ensemble, on a construit un dossier. On a d'abord demandé cette enquête-là à la Commission des droits de la personne. Plainte pour exploitation, plainte qui a été reçue. Il y a eu une enquête. À l'époque, on a eu l'aide aussi du Comité provincial des malades. L'enquête s'est faite. En cours de route, on a réussi à obtenir la mise en tutelle de l'établissement. Mais juste pour vous dire, puis vous allez comprendre un peu tantôt quand je parle des organismes publics qui n'ont pas été à la hauteur là-dedans, je vais vous dire comment la mise en tutelle s'est faite. Parce que l'enquête a commencé, puis qu'est-ce qui est arrivé, c'est que les premiers employés qui venaient témoigner, ce qu'on avait appris, c'est que Coutu, le propriétaire, les menaçait de congédiement s'il parlait, ou les menaçait de toutes sortes de choses si les gens révélaient qu'est-ce qui se passait. Alors, on est allé voir le ministre, Mme Navarro, à l'époque, qui nous a dit, écoutez, ça n'a pas d'allure que l'enquête puisse se faire dans ces conditions-là. Il faut mettre la boîte en tutelle. À un moment donné, on apprend qu'on est convoqué au bureau de la ministre qui nous annonce que la boîte est mise en tutelle. Donc, on était à 188, on était très heureux de tout ça. Sauf que l'après-midi, on va d'abord vous demander d'écouter, est-ce que il n'y a pas une crainte que M. Coutu fasse appel de votre décision? Non, on a pris nos précautions. Excellent. L'après-midi, je reçois au bureau de façon clandestine l'entente entre M. Coutu et le gouvernement. Alors, M. Coutu avait accepté qu'on mette sa boîte en tutelle pourvu qu'on le compense pour les profits qu'il n'aurait pas fait pendant les 2 prochaines années. Alors, on lui a donné 100 quelques mille dollars net pour qu'il reste chez lui. D'ailleurs, ça lui a permis de payer ses procureurs pour nous combattre devant la Commission des droits de la personne en plus, là. Alors, c'est ce genre d'entente-là. Puisque quand je vous dis que les autorités publiques, là, en termes d'alignement dans ces matières-là, ne sont pas assez préoccupées des droits des personnes et des besoins des clients, mais sont préoccupés par toutes sortes d'autres circonstances, toutes sortes d'autres facteurs, toutes sortes d'autres intérêts politiques, on a eu à faire face à cet aspect-là. Quand il est arrivé le temps de sortir, les clients, parce que les clients ne sont pas sortis dans le cadre d'un plan préparé, hein. Essentiellement, ce qui est arrivé, c'est que la tutelle durait depuis 2 ans, elle devait durer 2 ans. Et il devait y avoir des négociations pour sortir les gens de la communauté, sauf que le syndicat qui était en place, qui était composé de bon nombre de proches de M. Coutu, essayait simplement de gagner du temps pour essayer avec l'espoir que M. Coutu récupère son permis, qu'on continue comme avant, une fois l'enquête terminée. Et on a eu vent à un moment donné aussi que le ministère se prêtait le ministère devait décider si oui ou non il remettait le permis. On avait vu aussi que le ministère s'apprêtait à racheter le permis de M. Coutu. Là, à l'époque, on avançait des chiffres de 3 à 4 millions qu'on devait y verser pour racheter son permis. Alors, ce qui est arrivé, c'est qu'essentiellement, c'est qu'à l'occasion d'un débrayage des employés du du pavillon Saint-Théophile, qui sont tous qui ont débrayé là, à très court délai de préavis pour aller protester contre les projets de réintégration sociale. Pendant qu'ils débrayaient, les cadres du centre d'accueil de Laval, avec des parents de Mme Berthiaume mais d'autres bénévoles aussi, sont allés sortir les 88 résidents de la boîte. Quand les gens sont revenus, quand les syndiqués sont revenus au travail, il y avait des nouvelles serrures, le pavillon était vide, les gens étaient tous dans la communauté. Là, le ministère, puis je vous donne encore ça comme alignement, première réaction du ministère à cette situation-là, ramener tout de suite les gens dedans. OK? Alors, on a dit au ministère, on a envoyé une petite lettre pas très polie, une lettre d'avocat, en disant, écoutez, si vous voulez ramener les gens dedans, il faudra que vous passiez sur le dos des parents. Parce qu'on va faire du pitage devant le pavillon pour empêcher les gens d'en venir. Le ministère a reculé. Alors, finalement, ça s'est négocié. On a négocié finalement la reclassification des employés. On a réussi à obtenir finalement l'annulation du permis du pavillon sans compensation, ce qui est une rareté aussi. Alors que le ministère s'apprêtait de la racheter 3 à 4 millions. Et il y a eu finalement ce printemps, au mois de mai 1995, le jugement du tribunal des droits de la personne qui a condamné M. Coutu et ses entreprises, et certaines de ses entreprises à verser 1,5 million de dommages aux résidents. Et là, la Cour d'appel, la semaine dernière, vient de permettre l'exécution du jugement, nonobstant appel. Alors, on va faire la démarche maintenant d'exécution. D'ailleurs, ça me fait plaisir de souligner, je ne sais pas s'il est parmi nous, mon collègue Philippe Demassy, qui présente la Commission des droits. Je ne sais pas s'il est ici, Philippe. Alors, il a marqué le meilleur. C'est ça. Alors, c'est l'étude, je n'ai pas fini sur le plan judiciaire, mais les victoires importantes qui ont déjà été remportées, même si on ne perçoit jamais l'argent, là, les victoires importantes ont déjà été remportées. On a sorti les gens. Les gens sont libres, heureux aujourd'hui. Ils font une vie ordinaire avec les grandeurs et les misères que la vie quotidienne offre. Mais vous avez vu, ces gens-là, la plupart, peut-être pas la plupart, mais quelques-uns travaillent, ont des projets de vie, une manière de vivre qui est bien différente. Dans ce contexte-là, des leçons qu'on peut tirer de tout ça. C'est clair que Saint-Office, c'est une lutte qui peut avoir un certain caractère extrême dans le sens suivant, c'est que c'est pas toutes les batailles qui impliquent qu'on doit aller aux tribunaux, prendre des avocats et tout ça. Mais il faut savoir, il faut être prêt à le faire quand on fait ce genre d'histoire-là. Ce qu'il faut savoir aussi, c'est que, évidemment, c'est pas une bataille qu'un avocat va faire tout seul. Moi, je peux vous dire une chose, c'est que je m'attribue un bien petit mérite dans tout ça. Le mérite principal, il revient d'abord aux gens avec qui j'ai travaillé, aux parents, des personnes qui ont dit non, ça n'a pas d'allure, on ne laissera pas passer ça. Parce qu'oubliez pas une chose, hein, chaque fois que vous fermez les yeux sur un abus, vous permettez qu'il se répète. Et vous permettez que d'autres abus se développent aussi. Et dans ces matières-là, il ne faut pas compter, comme je vous dis, sur le système public pour intervenir là-dessus. On est trop préoccupé par toutes sortes de facteurs autres. D'abord, les organismes publics qui pourraient intervenir, la plupart du temps, sont sans pouvoir. Les régies régionales là-dessus, puis le commissaire au plein n'ont pas de pouvoir de forcer des choses. Et par ailleurs, ils ne veulent pas le faire non plus. On ne sent pas cette volonté-là, de toute façon. Puis là, je dis ça, là, avec tout le respect que j'ai pour les gens qui font le travail quotidien de gestion des plaintes, là, dans la vraie vie, là, quand on met en cause des pratiques institutionnelles, professionnelles ou administratives ou médicales, c'est le mur. Alors ça, c'est une réalité qu'il faut, en tout cas, comme société, là, c'est clair qu'on a une réflexion à faire là-dessus. Parce que c'est pas acceptable qu'il existe dans notre société des poches d'immunité à l'égard de gens qui font des abus. Puis je ne parle pas d'abus criminels, je parle d'abus de pouvoir, d'abus psychologiques, d'abus de ce genre de choses-là, un peu comme ceux qu'on vous a décrits depuis le matin. Essentiellement, c'est que si on veut que les choses changent, c'est clair qu'à tous les niveaux où on est, puis qu'on soit intervenant, puis moi je dis souvent que les intervenants, ce sont les premiers à brimer les droits des personnes, mais c'est aussi les premiers qui peuvent en assurer le respect. Puis comme intervenant, chaque intervenant professionnel, qu'on soit préposé, professionnel, gestionnaire ou quoi que ce soit, on a un choix à faire de quel bord on veut être. On ferme dessus les yeux et on tolère, ou est-ce qu'on développe chacun pour soi la tolérance zéro. Puis dans ces matières-là, il n'y a rien à négocier. On ne négocie pas les droits des personnes. Il faut avoir un alignement. Puis quand on décide, quand on intervient, il faut savoir quel bord on est. Et ça va peut-être vous paraître drastique, mais moi je vous le dis, on est d'un bord ou de l'autre. On n'est pas entre les deux, il n'y a pas de petits abus. Il n'y a pas de petites choses qui se tolèrent, c'est comme ça ou c'est pas comme ça, c'est noir ou blanc. Et malheureusement, il n'y a pas de milieu dans ces matières-là. Et puis dans ce contexte-là, ce que je vous dirais aussi, c'est qu'on a beaucoup parlé des institutions, mais moi je ne pense pas non plus que sortir tout le monde dans la communauté, ça sera la fin des abus ou la fin du rêve, si on veut, ou l'accomplissement du rêve. Je pense que dans la communauté, dans de petites unités, il peut y avoir autant d'abus que dans les grosses. Et par ailleurs aussi, c'est que dans les institutions, jusqu'à nouvel ordre, en tout cas, il va y avoir on va encore avoir à vivre comme société, à défaut d'autres scénarios d'intervention ou d'encadrement, on va avoir à vivre avec ces organisations-là aussi. Il faut apprendre à fonctionner avec. Forcer la transparence, questionner, créer des réseaux. OK, puis ça, c'est important. Il y a tellement de gens isolés, tellement de gens qui baissent les bras. Parce que même quand les gens ont leur famille, souvent les familles baissent les bras de peur des représailles, de peur du lendemain. Je peux vous dire une chose, ces batailles-là, ils sont durs. Mme Carpentier, qui est le parent qui m'avait contacté initialement, avait vécu, on a fait toute cette bataille-là, puis d'autres parents aussi, aurait eu 1000 raisons de lâcher en cours de route. Puis je peux vous dire une chose, c'est que j'ai une profonde admiration pour une personne comme ça, puis le courage que ça prend. Puis je peux vous dire une chose, c'est pas payant pour une personne comme ça. Je ne parle pas en termes financiers, là, je parle en termes de gratification, puis en termes de pression et tout ça, là. C'est une difficulté après l'autre, après l'autre, après l'autre, après l'autre, après l'autre, puis il faut un courage extraordinaire pour passer au travers de ces choses-là. Et quand on s'engage là-dedans, je peux vous dire une chose, quand on s'engage dans ces batailles-là, d'abord, on se sent souvent très isolé, très tout seul. Mais ce qu'il faut savoir, c'est qu'on n'est jamais tout seul là-dedans. Il y a toujours quelque part, d'abord, il existe des organisations, des organismes avec lesquels il faut travailler. La fondation qui a organisé l'activité d'aujourd'hui, la Fondation Handicap-Vie-Dignité, d'autres organisations impliquées dans la défense des droits sont des ressources précieuses pour ça. Il faut aller aussi il faut mobiliser les parents. Ça n'en prend pas beaucoup, hein? À 3 ou 4, on est capable de déplacer des grosses montagnes, pourvu qu'on ait la volonté de le faire. OK? Et c'est pas la grosseur des montagnes qui fait peur, c'est quand on veut et qu'on pense que ce qu'on fait est juste, on peut y arriver. Il faut se créer des réseaux, donc avec des organismes. Dans Saint-Théophile, on a eu l'aide de l'Association du Québec de l'intégration sociale, l'Association canadienne de l'intégration communautaire, une série d'autres organismes aussi, comme le Comité des malades a été présent tout le long aussi. Une série d'autres organismes à tous égards qui nous ont aidés dans ces matières-là. Il ne faut pas hésiter à se mobiliser aussi. Puis il faut travailler aussi à sensibiliser les gestionnaires, les intervenants aussi, parce que comprenons bien, dans la grande majorité des cas, les gestionnaires, les intervenants ne favorisent pas des politiques abusives. Sauf que des fois, ce qui va arriver, c'est que les milieux développent des cultures. C'est souvent des cultures institutionnelles. On va tolérer un certain niveau d'abus, puis on n'osera pas trop intervenir pour essayer de changer les choses là-dessus. Alors, il faut travailler d'abord à sensibiliser les gestionnaires, parce que dans un établissement, ça va de haut en bas. Puis quand la direction d'établissement a des valeurs, puis croit aux personnes, puis développe la culture du respect des droits, du respect des personnes, c'est plus facile de l'implanter à tous égards. Ce qu'on voit malheureusement, c'est que dans beaucoup d'établissements, puis je ne dis pas ça pour des personnes en particulier, mais on voit ça à beaucoup d'endroits, c'est que les préoccupations des gestionnaires et des professionnels est souvent orientée vers toute une série d'autres préoccupations que les droits et les besoins des clients. Lutte de pouvoir, statut, prestige, etc. Puis ça, on voit ça, là, puis je le dis sans vouloir dénoncer personne, là, je vous dis que c'est malheureusement une réalité. Les alignements qu'on prend à l'égard des clients, à l'égard des personnes à qui on fournit des services, je vous dirais que c'est la donnée fondamentale qui va faire en sorte que dans un milieu, le milieu sera plus ou moins abusif, ou ne sera pas abusif du tout. Puis dans ce contexte-là, les parents, les bénévoles, les gens impliqués dans la défense des droits, doivent travailler aussi auprès des intervenants, auprès des gestionnaires, et sensibiliser ces préoccupations-là aussi. Parce qu'évidemment, quand on convainc, quand on sensibilise les professionnels, c'est ceux qui donnent des services une base quotidienne à ces valeurs-là, on vient de faire un grand pas aussi pour assurer que les abus ne se produiront pas. Il faut savoir aussi qu'à lumière, puis ça c'est une des leçons que je garde de Saint-Théophile aussi, c'est que on peut donner comme slogan aussi, comptons sur nos propres moyens. Développons d'abord nos moyens, nos organisations. Ne laissons pas les autres le faire à notre place. Forçons les autres à le faire avec nous autres. C'est ça qui est important aussi. Puis développons, cette sensibilisation-là, elle doit se faire à l'échelle de la société. Elle ne doit pas se faire juste dans les milieux directement concernés par ces questions-là. Il faut sensibiliser aussi les milieux professionnels, autres que ceux de la santé, les milieux d'affaires, les milieux syndicaux. Alors, quand on parle des milieux syndicaux, c'est une problématique sur laquelle, en tout cas, beaucoup de gens, les milieux syndicaux sont maintenant plus ouverts. Il faut parler de ces choses-là aussi. Pourquoi est-ce que le syndicat, d'abord, par exemple, quelle politique, c'est-à-dire quel alignement doit prendre un syndicat pour défendre un syndiqué qui est abusif, par exemple, qui frappe un patient ou qui abuse un patient ou un résident? Est-ce que c'est des débats qu'il faut faire? Quel alignement on va prendre comme organisation aussi? Il faut... la solution à moyen terme, elle n'est pas... Il n'y a pas qu'une solution. C'est une solution qui est plus systémique, qui implique le développement de réseaux. D'ailleurs, les conférenciers qui vont suivre vont vous en parler. Je ne voudrais pas épuiser ce sujet-là non plus. Le recours au système judiciaire, malheureusement, c'est un recours qui est difficile, qui est long, qui est laborieux, qui est coûteux, mais il faut le faire de temps en temps. Il faut savoir, et simplement la possibilité qu'on puisse le faire va faire en sorte que souvent, il y a des choses qui n'auront pas à se rendre jusque-là. Puis il faut toujours là, que tous ceux qui veulent essayer de cautionner, ou encore de permettre ou de tolérer que des systèmes abusifs existent, il faut que ces gens-là sachent tous que quelque part, il n'existe pas d'immunité. Puis quelque part, par le biais de recours judiciaire, concernant toujours le système judiciaire comme étant un système ou comme étant un recours ultime, là, mais il y a des situations où on n'a pas le choix. Puis il faut le faire. Puis l'intervention judiciaire ou la stratégie judiciaire, si on veut, il faut la concevoir aussi comme étant simplement un des moyens de lutte qu'on a pour permettre effectivement de régler certains problèmes. Il y a des fois où on ne peut pas le faire. Il y a des fois où les limites aussi du contexte dans lequel on intervient ne permettent pas qu'on aille plus loin, à mener par exemple que certains types d'enquêtes. Prenez par exemple le cas de l'hôpital Rivière-des-Prairies. J'ai été impliqué là-dedans il y a quelques années aussi, pour les parents qui avaient mené cette enquête-là. Il y a eu une enquête publique sur l'hôpital qui a reconnu le bien fondé de toutes les plaintes que les parents avaient fait par rapport au mauvais service qui était donné par cet établissement-là. Sauf que la bataille s'est perdue, non pas sur le plan juridique, mais s'est perdue sur le plan politique. Où à cette époque-là, le ministère a décidé de dire oui, c'est vrai, il y a un grand nombre d'abus, mais on va faire confiance à la direction qui est là pour changer ça. Et je vous dirais que je ne serais pas surpris que s'il y avait une enquête aujourd'hui sur cet hôpital-là, qu'on retrouve à peu près les mêmes histoires qu'on trouvait il y a 10 ans aussi. Dans le cas Saint-Théophile, on était plus chanceux. On a réussi à aller plus loin. Sauf que c'est clair que de lutte en lutte, notre législation a changé. On a une meilleure jurisprudence maintenant. Puis c'est pour ça qu'il faut faire cette question-là. Il faut faire ces batailles-là aussi parce que ça fait avancer des idées. Ça fait avancer des valeurs. Ça sensibilise aussi. Il faut le faire. On ne les gagnera pas toutes. On ne peut pas toutes les gagner. On ne peut pas toutes les faire non plus. Mais il faut les faire. Et juste savoir qu'on en fait une de temps en temps. Ça va en éviter beaucoup aussi. Puis dans ce contexte-là, ce que je vous dirais, c'est que tous, comme parents, intervenants, bénévoles, soyez ouverts à ces choses-là aussi. Il faut travailler à se sensibiliser à la condition des personnes qui sont plus vulnérables. Parce que je pense qu'une société, si on veut mesurer la fibre démocratique d'une société, on la mesure toujours à la façon dont on traite ces personnes les plus vulnérables. Et si on ne veut pas se poser des questions inquiétantes pour l'avenir de notre société, il est temps qu'on regarde qu'est-ce qu'on fait actuellement et qu'est-ce qu'on va faire bientôt avec nos personnes vulnérables. Alors, je pense que ça épuisait mes commentaires. Je deviens intarissable quand je parle de tout ça, mais c'est ça, n'étant pas payé au mot aujourd'hui, alors je vais arrêter là.
Une chance qu'il ne faut pas payer le traducteur au mot. Y aurait-il une ou deux questions vite, madame?
Bon, j'ai vu Mme Carpentier pour la première fois l'automne 85. Ça va faire bientôt. On a fêté nos 10 ans cette année, nos 10 ans de vie commune cette année, là. Alors, on a commencé en novembre 85. On a, 86, il y a eu une série pardon, je me trompe, c'est novembre 85. Puis en 86, on a eu une série de rencontres pour constituer le dossier, de rencontres avec différents organismes. C'est en 87 qu'on a déposé la plainte, la Commission des droits, et la tutelle est arrivée en 88. C'est quand même là. Écoutez, d'abord, juste pour être bien, qu'il n'y ait pas de doute sur la personne, c'est pas le Jean Coutu de la pharmacie, des pharmacies, là, ni le Jean Coutu comédien, c'est un autre Jean Coutu qui a réussi. Alors, non, la bonne nouvelle, c'est qu'on a appris que ses affaires étaient rendues aux Bahamas. Alors, ça fait qu'il a peut-être ouvert un centre d'accueil aux Bahamas, je ne sais pas, là. Parce que là, c'est notre problème d'exécution actuellement, là.
Parce que le problème, c'est que vous pourriez faire beaucoup d'argent à vous promener d'un centre à l'autre. Est-ce que vous avez vu, comme madame dit, c'est systémique. Moi, je travaille comme infirmière depuis 30 ans. Ici, je passais mes journées à faire des plaintes qui me sont visibles parce que le sujet me préoccupe. Je suis sûre que c'est incroyable. Et quand on parle du silo du silence, c'est aussi lourd que le mur de Berlin. Là. On n'a pas besoin d'aller à Berlin. Ici, au Québec, ça existe.
Il n'y a pas de recette magique pour ça. Hein? L'idée, c'est que chacun de vous, dans votre sphère à vous, sur votre unité, à l'égard des gens qui vous fournissent des services, si vous pouvez déjà repousser un petit peu les frontières des abus, ça sera là. Puis lorsqu'on mettra toutes ces toutes ces démarches-là ensemble, on va être capable de les reculer un petit peu.
Moi, je travaille dans le domaine communautaire aussi, avec beaucoup de familles d'accueil, de résidence pour personnes âgées et personnes handicapées, entre autres. Un phénomène auquel on assiste très souvent maintenant, c'est que lorsqu'on ferme une de ces résidences, eux autres prennent un avocat et passent à l'offensive très, très rapidement, ce qui crée énormément de problèmes et de temps aussi, le temps de négocier tout ça. Est-ce que, et ça arrive, c'est rendu maintenant une donnée, le système se légalise de plus en plus. Alors, à chaque fois qu'il y a une dispute, de suite, on embarque dans des choses légales. Est-ce que les avocats sont aussi sensibilisés à cet aspect-là pour de ce genre d'enjeu auquel on parle?
On travaille à le faire aussi chacun dans nos milieux. Tantôt, quand je vous disais qu'on travaille à le faire chacun dans nos milieux, je vous dirais que dans mon milieu, je travaille aussi à sensibiliser d'autres collègues, puis je ne suis pas le seul d'ailleurs qui a une ouverture par rapport à ces choses-là. Mais on a du travail à faire aussi. Un travail même immense dans notre milieu aussi. Et par ailleurs aussi, c'est qu'il ne faut pas avoir peur. Moi, ce que je remarque, c'est qu'au niveau justement des gestionnaires, on a une peur panique de ces choses-là. Et la peur, elle est surtout du fait qu'on ne sait pas comment dealer avec ça. Quand on sait comment, alors on prépare nos dossiers en conséquence, puis on fera toutes les procédures du monde, peu importe par qui sera visé par la décision. Si le dossier il est bien fait, il est bien tenu, il est bien organisé, ces gens savent qu'est-ce qu'il faut établir. Le risque est minime. Mais il ne faut pas avoir peur de ces choses-là. Il faut toujours se situer par rapport à la personne vulnérable. Quand on n'a pas cet alignement-là,
Sauf que monter un dossier prend un temps et un investissement énorme et des ressources financières aussi énormes pour aller en cours et pour se battre. Et ça finit en quelque part par devenir un blocage. Pas parce qu'il n'y a pas de volonté nécessairement, mais rien que les ressources humaines impliquées pour monter un dossier qui doit aller en cours nous empêche de faire le travail ailleurs. Enfin, c'est une réalité en quelque part qui est très présente.
Sans aller très loin là-dessus, je vous dirais qu'il peut y avoir du préventif qui peut être fait. Puis aussi qu'il faut peut-être aller à l'essentiel. Donc, comprendre c'est quoi l'essentiel, comprendre que quand il y a un litige judiciaire, qu'est-ce qui est en cause. OK? On n'a pas besoin d'avoir des dossiers de 300 pages d'épais. C'est d'avoir les bonnes affaires. Ça peut se résumer des fois en 2 pages, ça peut être assez.
Moi, je voudrais juste un commentaire. Quand Maître Ménard disait tout à l'heure que c'est très coûteux, moi, j'aimerais approcher cette chose-là. Ça fait la 2e cause que je suis dedans. J'étais arrivée à des Prairies et là, le pavillon Saint-Théophile. Et les deux, ce sont des parents qui sont partis. Et nous, les parents, nous n'avons pas un sou. Nous commençons avec un petit groupe de parents ensemble. Et quand on nous dit, à la première cause, on nous a dit, get yourself a lawyer. Quand vous n'avez pas un sou, puis quelqu'un vous dit, allez donc voir le maître Ménard, il dit, j'accepte. Nous, notre groupe de parents, de la première cause, on lui doit encore 25 000. Cette 2e cause, les parents lui doivent au-dessus de 30 000. Alors, je trouve, et toutes les causes ont des dépenses. Les autres, les avocats étaient payés par le gouvernement, qui avaient tout était payé par le gouvernement. Et nous, comme parents, nous n'avons pas un sou, nous sommes en dette. C'est vrai qu'il nous a lavé la première dette parce qu'il dit qu'il ne pourrait pas fonctionner dans la communauté comme association. C'est juste, et pour nous, moi, je crois à la justice avec un grand J. Mais après ces 2 causes-là, comme parents, tu dis, faut y aller de l'avant parce que le gouvernement de tous les paliers ne remue pas. Alors, comme parent, tu défends les droits de ton fils, ta fille, des choses comme ça, tu es obligé d'aller de l'avant et vous n'avez pas un sou. Et c'est pas tout le monde, vous n'avez pas beaucoup de gens qui peuvent prendre ces causes-là, qui disent j'ai pas un sou au bout de la ligne. Alors, comme parent, moi, je me demande s'il n'y a pas ici, je suis entre amis, j'espère aujourd'hui, je me demande si quelqu'un n'aurait pas une idée en quelque part qu'il se fasse un fonds au niveau du ministère pour aider les parents à la base, parce qu'on parle toujours de la base. Si on est tous ici aujourd'hui, il y a beaucoup d'entre nous qui travaillons avec des personnes. Alors, c'est la base, c'est l'argent du système, c'est notre argent, c'est nos taxes, qu'on ne pourrait pas mettre un montant de côté, que les parents pourraient s'en servir quand nous avons une cause juste pour faire avancer ça, parce que nous y allons par miettes. Moi, je me souviens, un dimanche après-midi, chez Maître Ménard, nous étions 17, et 17, c'est des bénévoles, nos amis, nos parents, qui sont venus aider pour mettre un mémoire ensemble. C'est de l'effort, puis on n'a pas un sou. Alors moi, j'aimerais passer le message aujourd'hui. Il faut merci.
Deuxième message, on est obligé de vous charger, là.
Juste pour clarifier une chose, j'ai toujours dit à Mme Berthiaume qu'on n'avait pas de dette. Alors, je vais juste clarifier ça, mais là, je vais lui dire publiquement qu'on a. C'est ça. Alors, regardons ça comme ça.
Disabilities and complex needs, to move into the community from the institution. He was also the director of policy and programs for the Ontario Association for Community Living. Ensuite, il s'est occupé, he organized the lobby to eliminate the use of cattle props, les chocs électriques, on people with intellectual disabilities. C'était des pratiques courantes. Il est maintenant rendu, he's now a lecturer at the University of Wales in Swansea. He has been our very close associate for this project. We have had long and animated discussion, but I mean, we've come a long way and it's a great association. Alors, je vous laisse entre ses mains.
Sometimes very animated discussions.
4:30, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess my job is one of the more less exciting and interesting parts, but I think hopefully no less important, is to talk about advocacy and the structure of advocacy and what we mean by advocacy. And I think it's particularly important right now because more and more we're seeing advocacy get integrated into legislation, governments getting involved in advocacy and taking over advocacy. So I think it's important to go back and look at some of the fundamental questions about advocacy and where advocacy should lie and what the government should and shouldn't do in relation to advocacy. So the central question, I guess, of this conference is around abuse and whether advocacy is a solution to abuse. Well, I think that the short answer is no. Unfortunately, that I think there's a few things that can be said because advocacy can do some things that can reduce the likelihood of abuse. I think it can reduce the duration of the occurrence of abuse. I think it can enhance its detection and contribute to the elimination of some of the structural features of our system in the health and social services which increase the likelihood of abuse. So in my paper, hopefully short paper, I want to consider what we mean by advocacy and look at the nature of some of the various forms of advocacy and their role in an overall advocacy system and how they can contribute to reducing, if not eliminating, abuse. Before we do that, I want to spend a little bit of time on definitions so that we're clear in our head what we mean by an advocate and who is an advocate and what advocating is in terms of who they speak for. First, I just want to look quickly at the question of vulnerability. I think the Dick Sobsby video actually covered much of this, but for me, I think there's two key questions, two key aspects to vulnerability. The first is that I think we have to be clear that there's nothing about being old or being disabled that makes one inherently vulnerable. You can't associate the two. The vulnerability are things we construct around it. I think the two most important elements are firstly, when you combine either age or disability or health issues with dependency. That when people are dependent either for communication, for mobility, or for any of their basic needs, I think that's the first key element of vulnerability. The second aspect, and we've heard about this earlier, is that of isolation. And this could be isolation at home, in an institution, or simply social isolation. And by that I mean where people don't have what we call a personal network, or don't have people around them who are there just because they care about them. Now, people may have large networks of professionals around them. They may have large networks of support people, or they may live in environments where a lot of people have been placed around them. But there's no personal network. There's no one who's there because they care about them as an individual. And I think that's an important element when we go on to talk about advocacy. As I said, I think one of the important aspects of both these elements is that they're both socially constructed. You know, we construct dependency by not providing appropriate supports, by not providing aids, by not providing interpreters. We make people dependent. Isolation we create in a whole variety of ways, sometimes very directly, as we've heard, by placing people in institutions and then, in many cases, actively severing them from their networks. For many, many years, it was common practice in institutions for people with intellectual disabilities for parents to be told, put them in, leave them alone, and that everything will be better. Some institutions actually had policies where when you placed your son or your daughter, you could not visit for 3 months or 6 months. So we created that isolation quite purposefully because it allowed the institution to function better. So I want to keep those two aspects in the back of our minds as we go through this. The second thing I want to look at is just the whole question of what we mean by advocacy. And you hear advocacy a lot these days, and you see it a lot in the literature. And it's come to mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, from legal representation to more social functions of advocacy. Well, my main concern here is to focus on the social side, that we're not talking about advocacy that's largely undertaken by lawyers and is not limited to legal representation. It's not to say that lawyers and law, as Jean-Pierre just pointed out, may not be an important part of advocacy, but it's not what we mean by social advocacy. The Ontario Review of Advocacy for Vulnerable Adults defines social advocacy as speaking with vigor and vehemence and commitment on behalf of vulnerable adults. So I think the key point here is that it goes beyond just representing someone, that there's a certain passion, there's a certain vigor behind that speaking for someone. And I think most importantly, there's a commitment behind that. And I think that commitment is the personal commitment that I just spoke of. Now the problem, I think, with that definition is it doesn't define any kind of parameters for advocacy. And it raises the question, well, does the advocate speak on what they think is best for the person? Or do they speak on behalf of the person for what they would want for themselves? And that's a key distinction, and it's one I think most families and advocates always struggle with, is, what would I like best, as opposed to what does my son or daughter want, or what does my friend want, or what does my mom and dad want? So it's a difficult question, and I think one that any parent has struggled with an awful lot in their advocacy. So we need to add another element, I think, to our definition around to what the scope of advocacy is. Now, if you look at most definitions of advocacy, they'll refer to needs and rights of the individual or the groups concerned. So in terms of abuse, that would mean the advocate's concern are things like the individual's right to security of the person, to freedom from harm. We can take that a little further, and that the advocate has a role in eliminating the conditions that are going to increase the likelihood that those rights are going to be infringed. And that, again, may occur on a systemic level, a collective level, or an individual level. But I think the key point is the emphasis on rights. And I think it gives us a bit of an insight into the scope or the parameters for the advocate's activities. What's legitimate for an advocate to do? Now, in Western political theory, our rights are grounded in the idea of autonomy, in the person's ability to be who they want to be, to do what they want to do, to be a unique individual rather than a label or a member of some group. So the advocate's role, then, is to safeguard that individual's capacity for self-determination. And again, that suggests advocacy maybe at a systemic level, where you're going to work on removing conditions that would limit anybody's chance of doing what they want to do and being who they want to do. Or it may be on a very personal level, on a particular level, what John or Jane or Bill wants for themselves. Now, this raises the next question that I think is one of the most problematic ones, and it certainly is the big sticking point when we try to gain rights for advocates of access into information, and that's, well, how does the advocate know what the person wants? How can anyone really speak for another person? And I think that obviously most acute in situations where people can't say what they want in a formal way. They can't speak, or they don't communicate with a formal system. So if we wanted to avoid a paternalistic approach, if we want to avoid just doing what we think is best for the person, we have to find some way to address this problem of how do we know what someone would like or someone would want. And again, it becomes particularly acute when we start to look at the legal aspects of how do we ensure an advocate has access to a person, has access to information, has access to the meetings and decisions that are going to make a difference between the person getting what they want or getting what someone else thinks they should have or shouldn't have. But I think, again, the answer is implied in the definition of rights that I gave around autonomy. That if rights are embedded in this notion of autonomy, then it follows that the advocate draws their legitimation, their right to advocate, from the personal bond and commitment they have to that person. That knowledge of the person in an intimate kind of way. They know how they communicate. They know what they like or don't like. And I spent many, many years with families and people with very severe intellectual disabilities. And whenever you'd walk in to meet someone, or you go pick them up in an institution, or you'd spend time with people, you know, their families would always know. They'd say, oh, when he does that with his left eyebrow, that means he's happy, he's sad, he doesn't like this. And that's not a knowledge you can teach. That's not a knowledge you can get a degree in. That's not a knowledge a professional can ever bring to that relationship. It's only a knowledge that someone who has this personal bond and commitment has. This idea of a personal bond or a strong attachment has actually been recognized in our law, in our guardianship law, a long time. John Stuart Mill, the English political philosopher in the last century, who was one of the sternest defenders of individual liberty, he said that no one can ever come to any real knowledge of the interests of another person and have no real stake in their autonomy. But he notes one exception. It's a little footnote in his book on liberty, and it says, well, the only exception is in cases of strong personal attachment. So the idea isn't new. And trouble is, it's been recognized in law more recently, but often limited to family relationships, and usually only when the family is willing to go along with the system. One of the changes that we're seeing in law is that that's less and less the case. It's less limited to relatives. There's been a couple of judgments where friends have been favored in guardianship cases over family. In the Quebec Act, the new act on the public curator, it technically gives equal weight to relatives or those showing a special interest in the person. In fact, it's still very difficult for non-related advocates to effectively advocate. What will often happen is if an advocate's causing problems for an institution or saying things that the institution doesn't like, that's when they'll immediately run out to find a relative. Not before, when they needed someone there to advocate, but they'll run out and they'll call up, do you know what this person's doing to your sister? It's terrible, and they're going to make all these awful decisions, and you better come in here and sign an order to get rights to make decisions for them. So we have a problem that I think we need to, one of the things that has to change in law is this recognition that the core is the bond, not a blood relationship. The core is a demonstrated personal bond. So I think this personal relationship is the key to any effective or legitimate advocacy, whether individual or systemic. And that I think once we depart from that point, either through professionalizing advocacy or becoming too caught up in issues as opposed to people, that we lose something critical in advocacy. What I'd like to do now is just go through some of the components and what I think is required to make those components effective in an overall advocacy system. Some of the key requirements, I think, for all aspects of advocacy, as I mentioned, the core of any advocacy, it has to be grounded in the personal bond and commitment. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that might work in a more systemic advocacy situation a little later. Obviously, it has to have access to the person. The system, an advocacy system, has to be able to provide information to the person and to their advocates quickly and effectively. It's particularly important at times of crisis and critical decisions. So any of you know that have had to go through a legal route or a complaints route, it's too late by the time that process is finished if it's a crisis situation. And the system knows that. And they'll use that. The last point is that I think an advocacy system and an advocate has to have presence. And what I mean by that is the most effective tool in advocacy, far more important than legal judgments, legal force, is just presence. We all know that if someone has someone that's there, that's looking out, that's going to say, how did he get that bruise? When was the last time this was changed? That's what's going to get the system to be more cautious, to watch themselves and watch their activities. So any advocacy system has to have presence that's a presence, again, that's personal. That the system knows somebody's there, is concerned about John, is going to notice that there's a bruise, that this hasn't happened. And that's what's threatening to them. That's, I think, Dina's speaker earlier, why they didn't want her around. It's because she saw those things. And their solution was to make sure she wasn't around. So I think there's some of the key overall aspects that any advocacy system has to have. So again, with these sort of basics in mind, I'd like to go through some of the non-statutory and statutory aspects to advocacy and what they might need to be effective. The most common and effective form of advocacy, and I think we have to be reminded of this, is always self-advocacy. You know, however many people, sorry, let me go back for a second. That for many people with severe disabilities who are extremely vulnerable, this isn't as simple as it may appear. That if you can't speak, or if you can't get the energy to complain or argue, several of our speakers earlier talked to the degree of stress they were under, they may not always be able to speak for themselves. But I think we always have to try to make that the first and best option. Some of the things that limit that often that right has been legally removed from them through guardianship, incapacity judgments. More frequently, it's done through manipulation, through patronizing, that we don't allow people to speak for themselves. Oh, that's okay, dearie, don't you worry, we'll take care of everything for you. And they often do, unfortunately. I think that if we don't recognize that an individual's right to assert their rights to make decisions, however they communicate, then we've lost the advocacy battle before we start. Now, sometimes it's difficult for people to complain or advocate for themselves because they're dependent on the very systems they're advocating against, or the very people, for all their daily needs. As we've heard descriptions, they won't hesitate to take reprisals on you. Just being a little bit later, bringing your food, taking it away a little earlier, as Diane was describing. So sometimes it's difficult for people to be the front person in their own advocacy because they're going to bear the brunt from the system. I think the final point is that a lot of people haven't been allowed to develop the skills to make decisions for themselves, that we haven't allowed them to give the knowledge, the skills, the assertiveness to speak for themselves. So for all of those reasons, self-advocacy is not quite as simple as it may. So some of the key things that are necessary, again, is firstly the clear recognition of the individual's right to decide for themselves. Second, they have to be given support and information that's necessary to make informed decisions. And finally, alternative means of communication have to be recognized and supported with appropriate aids or interpreters, or, as I mentioned, having the people there who know how they communicate. A couple other changes that as advocacy develops, that I think self-advocacy needs forums, places for mutual support and information sharing. So we have organizations like People First and the Psychiatric Survivors Movement that can support each other and share stories and just give moral support to each other in their self-advocacy. More formally, we've had the emergence of users groups and committees such as those we've heard about here in Quebec. If these are to be effective, though, they have to be completely independent of the institutional structures. I think too often users groups become exalted social groups or become tools that the institution uses not to enhance users' rights but to suppress them. You say, look, we have a users group and they didn't like this idea, so just shut up about it. You know, you had your chance. Another feature that's I relate to self-advocacy that's not often related to it, that we're seeing in new legislation, is the use of prior directives, and they take lots of different forms now, whether it's living wills, mandates here in Quebec, or Ulysses agreements. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Ulysses agreements, where usually people with mental health problems that are episodic, they'll write out in advance who is it they want to speak for them, what procedures they accept and don't accept, and they may set up what events trigger this agreement coming into force. So when I'm doing X, I want this agreement to come into force, and this is who speaks for me. I think what that does is it really extends the person's self-advocacy, self-direction into periods where they may not be able to articulate their own wishes. So I think they're important from that perspective. Now, again, we're seeing some movement towards these in legislation, that in BC, they have in the new legislation, you can register representation agreements with the public trustee. So they're legally recognized documents, and they'll state when they come in force, what triggering events, and there's no further process that has to be taken at the time. Quebec, it's a little more tedious with the mandates. You set up your mandate, but then when you want it into force, you have to go to court, have it homologated. I've yet to really figure out what maybe Jean-Pierre can explain what homologation means. But I think that's a good example of how, as we move to the legislative aspect, how sometimes legislation gets in the way of things. One aspect of Quebec's law, and the mandate law, is it does require some judgment on incapacity, which as soon as that judgment's made, means in law you've lost rights. And I think that's a problem here, both from the mechanism that essentially creates a loss of rights, a legal loss of rights, but also slows down the process, makes it more expensive and more tedious for people. I think the final aspect of self-advocacy that I want to talk about, again, that we're seeing in some of the new legislation, is the formal provision of rights, advice, and access to advocacy. In Ontario, the measures which have recently been thrown out the window by the current government after 9 years of work by various advocacy organizations, there was a provision that before anyone could be declared incapacitated, that they had to be offered a rights advisor, an independent rights advisor. It had to be explained to them what that was, and if they wanted to see them, a rights advisor had to be provided before you could move ahead with admission to facilities, incapacity judgments, or major health care decisions. In BC, I think they've gone a little better route, and hopefully these ones will survive, that they're required to inform what's called a prescribed advocacy organization. These are voluntary advocacy organizations. So that they have to inform them in cases of major health care decisions, admission to a facility, or appointment of a substitute decision maker. So before any of those things can occur, independent advocates have to be made available to the person, and their rights explained to them, and the supports available to them if they want to fight that decision. I think that's one of the more positive moves in some of the current legislation. Okay, well, let's move on now to what I call independent personal advocacy, which is separate advocacy. Again, I want to emphasize that the core of independent advocacy has to be this bond between the person and the advocate. And that's because it's unlikely that any professional advocacy service can ever meet the needs for advocacy, but more importantly, can never have this knowledge, know who that person is and what they want. I think that's important as governments start to consider advocacy systems, because my concern is that professional advocacy will wipe out or limit independent advocacy. But I think if independent advocates are going to succeed, there's several things that have to be in place. Firstly, I think the rights of the advocate to access the person and the relevant information have to be recognized and clearly spelt out. I mean, that sounds relatively simple, but when we get into issues like confidentiality and determining who is a legitimate advocate, that's when that aspect becomes a little bit problematic. Unfortunately, we've had improvements in our confidentiality law, but what we often see is confidentiality law used not to defend the person, but to defend the institutions, to protect that information from getting into the hands of advocates and families. Again, that's a caution when we move to progressive legislation around advocacy, that often what may appear progressive, once it gets into legislation, becomes a tool for the system and not the advocate. In most cases, there's going to be an obvious association between the advocate and the person, whether it's a family member or a relative. But in some cases, they may not be the best person to advocate. They may not be the person that the individual wants to advocate for them, or they may not be present, or for personal circumstances, the family may not be able to advocate in a given case. Now, one of the ways you could solve this is through the kind of things I described before, to representation agreements. You lodge it with a formal body that gives you a formal right to that information and access. The problem is that it can be time-consuming and tedious. Again, in the case of Quebec, it requires going to court. and requires some judgment of incapacity. The whole area in Quebec, when the advisor to person of full age, which I think was a progressive addition to the curatorship legislation and is typical of new legislation which gives levels of guardianship, even at the level of an advisor to person of full age, there is still some court judgment on incapacity and a person technically loses rights. So I think that route can be problematic going through the guardianship system. Also, I think it's always difficult when you try to legalize a personal relationship, when you make what's essentially a personal bond a legal process. I think, well, the other aspect that I think is disturbing, and I'm not sure, maybe Jean-Pierre would be able to enlighten us on this one, but it's interesting that of all the guardianship applications in Quebec, curatorship applications, I think less than 2% of them are for this minimal advisor role. Close to 98+% are for much more intrusive forms of guardianship. So another approach that's been considered is to have advocates register with either a state organization or approved voluntary organization. So you get your stamp as an approved advocate, which would then give you rights of access into information. Again, it solves some of the problems, but it still adds a level of bureaucracy and control to what's essentially a personal relationship. And I don't think there is a solution to this problem. I don't think there is a knockdown legal solution or procedural solution. I think one helpful thing that we could do in structures and legislation is to turn around the burden of proof. Right now, when the system challenges an advocate, it's up to the advocate to go through the process, to go to court, to get legitimated. I think if we could somehow turn around that burden of proof, that it would be the system's responsibility to prove that that advocate doesn't have a legitimate interest in the person, that advocate doesn't have a bond with that person. It would at least change the rules of the game a bit and make it easier for advocates to continue to advocate while the system is putting blocks in their way. I mentioned above that one of the key points is that the access has to have access to the person and to information. And we've seen, again, even in the case of families, how they will actively try to limit that access. I think there's some other things that will help. I think the kind of support and advice described earlier about the rights advisors should also be available to advocates. They should be able to access advisors and information that can advise them on different rights issues. I think in a lot of cases that could come and should come from voluntary organizations like Handicap-Dignity in Life, or through citizen advocacy schemes where there's a coordinator whose job is primarily to support advocates, to provide them with information. I think it's also important to remember that families often need that kind of support and advice, and also need just the mutual support, the chance to share stories, to cry, to hold each other's hand, to help you through what can often be a very difficult personal struggle for the advocate. And I think that's something we often neglect, is the personal needs of the advocates and the families. So I think that kind of support for advocates is crucial if we're going to develop a comprehensive advocacy system. Other things that might help, things like training and information, from things like strategies of advocacy to basic information on what different medications do, what different procedures are, and advice that's independent of the systems that are providing those services. And I think we have to look at a more effective way of funding advocacy bodies, independent advocacy bodies, that doesn't conflict them, but allows them to get on with the job of advocating and supporting advocacy. I'd just like to talk a bit more about systemic advocacy, that many voluntary organizations that exist are already providing this type of support, training, and information. As I say, this is a very good example right here. And I think there also is a role for those organizations to help find personal advocates for people who don't have an advocate. I don't think a professionalized advocacy finding system can ever work. But I think people who are there, who are committed, who know other people that are there and committed, can help make those links for people. I think that advocacy groups and organizations also have a key systemic role to play. I think that if you look at most of the really big changes in the health and social service system, they weren't brought about by professionals. They weren't brought about by social policy analysts. They were brought about by families and advocates and people who cared about the people who were in those systems and challenged them. They usually get picked up by people like me and academics who we write them up and give them fancy names and go around and give expensive talks about them. But they came from families and advocates, and I think that's the key role on systemic advocacy. One of the roles for advocacy groups in the BC legislation that I think is interesting for this group is they're part of setting up something called abuse and neglect community response networks, so that whenever there's a case or an allegation of neglect or abuse, that these networks will immediately go meet with people and they're independent of the system. They're community organizations that are involved in the initial investigation, setting up plans and supporting it. We don't know how that's going to work out yet, but I think it's an interesting idea. Now, I talked earlier about how all advocacy had to be grounded in the individual, and I think that's no less true in systemic basis, where solutions have to flow from the individuals. I'm getting a word here. What I'd call a case-to-cause advocacy. So you see a lot of advocacy groups that begin that way and then gradually develop their own liaisons with the system and services and lose their grounding in people, lose the personal attachment. And the changes that they bring about are no longer grounded in what people want as individuals, but what they see as important. Okay, I'll skip ahead to the last bit. It's on what statutory provisions be. I think there's obviously a role for organizations like the Ombudsman and the Human Rights Commission, but I think we have to remember that they're very limited and big picture involvements. They're not going to be able to help in very many cases of direct individual abuse. Another aspect, the whole move towards paid advocates and advocacy systems, I think is not going to work in the long run. The one study that was done on what were called protective workers, protective services workers, in this study they found that the vast majority of the protective service workers favored a paternalistic approach over an autonomy approach to their work. I think that advocates, professional advocacy may have a role to play in institution-based advocates, like the Patient's Advocacy Office, if it's independent, so that there's something right there in the institution, someone who's there, walking around, is involved. Again, as much for presence as any other reason. All right, I'll skip the last bit on some of the other structural things. But I think the last point I want to make is just that I think we have to keep in mind when we're looking at advocacy and thinking about advocacy systems is that really advocacy is there because of failure. That advocacy is a Band-Aid. The ideal that we should never need advocacy systems. That abuse and most of the things advocacy is involved in are there because of various moral failures, whether it's a discrete moral failure of an individual or a moral failure of our society, which creates monuments to that moral failure, which St. Charles Borromée, Rivière de Prairie, to my mind, are monuments to our moral failure as society. Until we can address that issue, advocacy can help us to work on that systems and eliminate it, But we can't ever forget the fact that advocacy is about our failure as a society. Thank you.
C'est très frustrant, là, parce que je dois couper la parole à des gens qu'on pourrait entendre longtemps. D'autre part, on est limité, on a la tempête, mais c'est merveilleux que vous soyez là. Last but not least, Madame Namiesh. Thank you, Tim, so much.